They say old age should be a time of peace, of quiet mornings, of warm meals surrounded by family, and of laughter echoing through the walls of your home. That's what I once believed too. But nothing could have prepared me for the silence I found myself living in, a silence so cold it felt like the walls themselves were ashamed to witness what was happening to me. I will never forget the day that burned itself into my memory like fire on wood. My daughter, Emma, leaned close to her husband's ear, thinking I was dozing off in my chair. Her voice was a whisper, but one meant to cut. "Don't worry, he won't last long. Just be patient." I froze. My heart stuttered inside my chest. She wasn't talking about a stranger, about some distant relative, but about me, her father, the man who once held her tiny hands as she learned to walk, the man who sacrificed nights of sleep and decades of work so she could go to school with shoes on her feet and food in her stomach. And now, in her eyes, I was reduced to a countdown, just a burden to be endured until nature took its course. In that moment, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just pain, it was betrayal. Imagine hearing your own child speaking of you as though you were already gone, as though your existence was nothing more than an inconvenience. I wanted to shout, to stand up and remind her of everything I had done, of every sacrifice, of every scar on these tired hands that came from giving her a better life. But no words came out. Instead, I sat there in my silence, staring at the floor, fighting the tears that burned behind my eyes. That wasn't the only time. There were other whispers, other moments. My son Daniel was bolder, less careful with his words. One evening, while his wife cleared the dishes, he said plainly across the table, "Dad, you should be grateful we keep you here. Most people your age end up in a home. You cost us a fortune, and the kids feel uncomfortable around you. Don't make things harder." Grateful. That was the word he used. As if I should bow my head in thanks for being tolerated in the very home that once belonged to me and my late wife. As if I hadn't already paid for every brick with the sweat of my youth. I looked at his face, my own son's face, and I barely recognized him. The softness I remembered from his childhood, the spark of innocence in his eyes, it was all gone. In its place was calculation, annoyance, and something colder than hatred, indifference. Do you know what indifference does to a man? Hatred at least acknowledges you exist. Indifference erases you while you're still breathing. Nights became the hardest. I would lie in my bed, listening to the muffled laughter coming from the living room. The sound of family gathered together, my family but without me. They closed the door between us, as if shutting me out of their circle made it easier to forget I was still alive. I could almost picture them sitting there, drinks in hand, smiling, while I stared at the ceiling above me, wondering when I had become less than human in their eyes. The small humiliations piled up. My meals were often served late, sometimes cold, as though I didn't matter enough to be included at the table. My medication was left on the counter without a word, as if my survival was just another chore on their endless list. And always, the stares, quick glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. The sighs of impatience when I walked too slowly. The way their voices softened into pity when they spoke about me to others, but sharpened into irritation when they spoke directly to me. I could handle the physical weakness of age. My joints ached, my breath came shorter. My hands shook when holding a cup of tea, but those were the natural tolls of life, the price of living long. What broke me wasn't the frailty of my body, but the cruelty of realizing I was no longer seen as a father, as a man, or even as a person of worth. One night stands out sharper than the rest. I had joined them in the living room, sitting quietly in the corner while they watched television. I didn't say much, I rarely did anymore. I wanted, just for a moment, to feel part of something, to belong. Daniel's little boy, my grandson, suddenly turned to me and asked innocently, "Why is Grandpa always here? Doesn't he have his own house?" The room went silent. My daughter-in-law's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer as she replied, "Because he's old, sweetheart. He has nowhere else to go." Nowhere else to go. As if I were some lost dog they had reluctantly taken in. I smiled at my grandson, pretending not to care, but inside, those words sank into me like stones. I had built homes, provided roofs, paid bills, and yet in their narrative, I was just a homeless relic, tolerated out of duty. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark, my hands trembling not from age, but from rage and sorrow. I asked myself questions I never thought I would have to face. Had my life been for nothing? Had I given my all to raise children who now only counted the days until my death? The truth was unbearable. They weren't waiting for me to live. They were waiting for me to vanish. And yet, here I am, still breathing, still alive, still telling my story. They waited for my death, but I am still here, and this time, I will not remain silent. You've heard how they treat me now, like a burden, like a shadow that refuses to fade. But perhaps I should take you back, far back, to when I was just a boy with more dreams than sense. Maybe then you'll understand who I am, and why their betrayal cuts so deep. I was born in a small town just outside Leeds, England. We didn't have much, not even proper shoes some winters, but we had resilience. My father worked in the mills, his hands always blackened with grease, his lungs wheezing from dust. My mother stitched clothes at home for neighbors to earn a few extra coins. Life was hard, but there was pride in hard work. They raised me to believe that if you gave your best, the world would reward you. I carried that belief like a torch through the darkness of poverty. As a young man, I wasn't clever in books, but I had a strong back and steady hands. I found work in construction, carrying bricks, mixing mortar, and slowly learning how buildings rose from the ground. Each paycheck, no matter how small, filled me with pride. I wasn't just earning, I was building the foundation for a future I hadn't yet seen. And then I met Irma Grant. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight and eyes that seemed to see straight through my rough exterior. She was the kind of woman who made you want to be better than you were. I still remember the first time I asked her out, stammering over my words as if my tongue had forgotten how to behave. To my surprise, she said yes. From that moment on, I was hers. We didn't have much when we married, just a tiny flat and secondhand furniture, but we had each other, and that was enough. Those early years were full of laughter, long walks, and whispered promises in the dark. We dreamed together, planned together, and believed together that life would get better. And it did, slowly, painfully, but surely. I worked long hours, on sites, often coming home with my hands raw and my back aching. But every time I opened the door and saw Margaret's smile, the pain melted away. She was my anchor, my partner, my reason. And when our first child, Emma, was born, I felt as though the world itself had been reborn inside that small hospital room. I held her tiny body, her fragile hands curling around my finger, and I swore then and there I would dedicate my life to giving her everything I never had. 2 years later, Daniel came along, crying louder than any baby I'd ever heard, a stubbornness already etched into his face. With 2 children, life became harder. Bills piled high, and some nights I went without dinner so they could eat, but I never complained. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in their happiness. I patched up their shoes, worked overtime shifts, and spent my Sundays repairing the house with my own hands so they would always feel safe. There were dreams I had to let go. I once wanted to travel, to see Paris, to stand in front of the Eiffel Tower with Margaret's hand in mine. But every time I thought of spending money on myself, I saw my children's faces instead, and the choice became clear. Dreams could wait, children could not. I remember Emma's first day of school. She clung to Margaret's dress, afraid to let go. I bent down, kissed her forehead, and told her, "Don't be afraid, love. This is the beginning of everything." I worked double shifts that week just to afford her new uniform and supplies. And when she walked into that classroom, head held high, I felt prouder than if I'd been crowned king. Daniel was different. He was bold, fearless, always getting into scrapes. I spent more than one evening at the school being told about some mischief he'd caused. But I defended him, encouraged him, and reminded him he could channel that energy into something meaningful. I believed in him even when others didn't. As the years passed, my body grew older, but my determination never wavered. I saved every spare penny, not for myself, but for their education, for their weddings, for the homes they would one day build. When Margaret fell ill, I stood by her side through every treatment, every sleepless night. I cooked, I cleaned, I held her hand when she was too weak to hold mine. And when the illness finally took her, a part of me died too. But I carried on for Emma, for Daniel, for the family we had built together. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that my sacrifices would be remembered, that when age finally caught up with me, my children would look at me with gratitude, maybe even pride. I pictured myself sitting at their tables, telling stories to my grandchildren, laughing together, being cherished as the root of the tree that had given them life. But reality was different. What I see now is coldness. What I feel is rejection. And what I hear are whispers waiting for my death. If you've ever wondered why betrayal hurts so much, it's because it never comes from enemies. Enemies can wound your body, but betrayal comes from those you once fed with your own hands, those you loved more than life itself. They are the only ones who can wound your soul. So when I tell you that I am not just an old man whining about neglect, understand this: I gave everything I had. My youth, my dreams, my health, my very heart, and in return, I am treated as though I am nothing. That is my past, that is who I am, and that is why their cruelty cuts deeper than words can ever say. It never happens all at once, you know. Betrayal doesn't crash into you like a storm, it seeps in slowly, drop by drop, until one day you're drowning and you don't even remember when the water started to rise. That's how it was with me. At first, it was subtle. I would sit at the table during meals, eager to join in conversation, but my words seemed to fall flat, disappearing into the air like smoke. The children, my grandchildren, would talk over me, too busy with their games and chatter to notice the old man trying to share a story. Their parents didn't correct them. No one said, "Listen to Grandpa." Instead, they carried on, as though my voice no longer had weight. One evening, I remember trying to tell a story about my days working in construction, how we once built a school despite the rain pouring for weeks. I thought it might inspire Daniel's eldest boy, who was struggling with perseverance at the time. But halfway through my tale, Emma cut me off with a sigh. "Dad, not now. The kids don't care about those old stories." The words stung more than she could ever know. Those old stories were my life, my sacrifices, my pride. To dismiss them so easily was to dismiss me. I stopped telling stories after that. Then came the comments about money. It started with offhand remarks, my complaining about the price of my medication, Daniel grumbling about the electricity bill. I tried to ignore it, but soon their words sharpened into barbs aimed directly at me. "Do you really need these pills, Dad?" Daniel asked once, holding up a prescription slip. "They cost a fortune, and you're all ready. Well, you know." He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. I was old, closer to the end than the beginning. In his eyes, maybe the medicine was wasted. Another time, Emma muttered to her husband while washing dishes, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear, "We could have taken a holiday this year, if not for Dad's expenses." A holiday. The thought that my existence was the obstacle standing between her and a beach somewhere was almost laughable. It hadn't cut so deep. It wasn't just money. It was space, too. My presence seemed to shrink the house, to press against their comfort. I could feel it in the way they sighed when I walked too slowly down the hallway, or when I lingered too long in the kitchen making tea. They rearranged furniture without asking me, moved my chair further from the center of the living room, until I felt pushed into corners, both physically and emotionally. Meals became smaller, humiliations. Sometimes they ate without me, claiming I had been asleep. Other times, my plate was left on the counter long after everyone had finished. The food congealed and cold. I would sit at the table alone, chewing in silence, while the faint sound of laughter drifted from the living room. It wasn't just hunger. I felt it was loneliness served on a plate. The worst were the whispers I wasn't meant to hear. Late at night, when the house grew quiet, voices would slip through the walls. How much longer do you think this will go on? Emma's voice, tired and sharp. Not long. He's 78. He can't last forever, her husband replied. And then, laughter. Soft, cruel laughter. I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Not once did I hear words of care, of love, of gratitude. Only impatience. Only the ticking clock of their waiting. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel talking on the phone. He didn't know I was in the hallway. His words still echo in my mind. Yeah, once Dad's gone, the house will be ours. Finally. No more restrictions. No more extra mouths to feed. The house. The same house I had built brick by brick. The same house I had paid for with sweat and years of labor. To him, I was nothing more than an obstacle between him and ownership. It was then I began to notice the small, fleeting glances that passed between them whenever I coughed, whenever I winced from pain, whenever I sat down a little too heavily. Hopeful looks, as if each sign of weakness brought them closer to freedom. Do you know what it feels like to realize your children are waiting for you to die? It is a loneliness beyond words. It is standing in a room full of people who share your blood and feeling invisible, unwanted, unloved. There was a night when my grandson asked, in that innocent way only children can, "Mom, when will Grandpa be gone?" The room froze. Emma looked at me, then at her son, and instead of correcting him, instead of telling him life is precious, she just said, "Soon, darling, don't worry." That was the moment I realized the poison of their impatience had seeped into the next generation. Even the children had learned to see me as temporary, disposable. I stopped going into the living room after that. I stayed mostly in my bedroom, surrounded by the silence of my own thoughts. I became a ghost in my own home, drifting quietly from one corner to another, careful not to disturb the living. And yet, every night, I prayed. I prayed not for death, but for strength, for clarity, for the dignity, to face each day with my head held high, even as my family chipped away at my soul. The conflict had grown, the signs of rejection had multiplied, but I knew deep down that the worst was still to come. Every man has a breaking point. For some, it comes in war, in the clash of violence and survival. For others, it comes in sickness, when the body gives out and the will follows. For me, it didn't come from my failing knees or my trembling hands. It came from the cruelty of those I loved most, and it arrived on a night I will never forget. The day had been ordinary enough. Ordinary in the way my days had become quiet, lonely, with me drifting from room to room like an unwelcome guest. I had spent most of the afternoon in my small corner of the garden, trimming what little remained of Margaret's roses. She used to love them, how their blooms seemed to brighten even the grayest English morning. I tended them now not because I loved gardening, but because it made me feel closer to her. By the time evening came, the smell of dinner filled the house. Roast chicken, potatoes, carrot sit, reminded me of Sundays when the children were young, when Margaret would cook and laughter would fill every corner. I walked toward the dining room, hoping, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might be different. That maybe, just maybe, they'd let me sit with them at the table, like old times. But as I reached the doorway, Daniel blocked my path. His face was firm, cold, the kind of expression I used to see only in strangers. "Dad," he said flatly, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made my stomach twist. He didn't invite me in. He didn't even step aside. He stood there like a guard, keeping me out of my own dining room. Behind him, I could hear the clatter of plates, the voices of the children, Emma's laughter as she set the table. It was a scene of family except I wasn't part of it. "You'll be eating in the garage from now on," he continued. His words were sharp, deliberate. "The kids, they don't want to see you at the table. It makes them uncomfortable, and frankly, it makes us uncomfortable too." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "The garage," my voice cracked, thin and broken. "Yes, there's space there. You can set up a little table. Keep your things out of the way. It's better for everyone. For everyone. Everyone but me. I tried to speak, to protest, to remind him that this was my house, that I had built this life brick by brick. But the words caught in my throat. My chest felt tight, my eyes burned, and all I could manage was a whisper. Daniel, I'm your father. He didn't flinch, and we're your family. But families need boundaries. This is what's best. With that, he placed a tray in my hands, a plate of food, already cooling, already separate from theirs. He didn't even look at me as he turned back into the dining room, closing the door behind him. I stood there, the tray trembling in my hands, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the other side. My family was together, sharing a meal, while I stood alone in the hallway with a plate of leftovers, exiled like a stranger. The garage was cold. Damp air seeped through the walls, carrying the faint smell of oil and rust. I sat on an old wooden stool, balancing the tray on my knees. The chicken was tough, the potatoes dry, but it wasn't the food that choked me, it was the silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any insult. I ate slowly, each bite heavy in my mouth, tears slipping down my cheeks unnoticed. I had cried before, of course, when Margaret died, when I buried my parents, but this was different. This wasn't grief. This was humiliation. That night, lying in the thin blanket I had dragged out to the garage, I finally broke. My body shook with sobs I couldn't contain. I pressed my hands to my face, ashamed of my own weakness. But the pain was too much to bear. I thought of Margaret. What would she say if she saw me like this? She had always believed in the goodness of our children, always defended them when I was strict. Would she have seen this betrayal coming? Or would her heart have shattered just like mine? I thought of the years I had worked until my bones ached, the nights I had gone hungry so my children could eat, the dreams I had buried so theirs could bloom. And for what? To end my days eating alone in a garage, cast aside like rubbish. That was the breaking point. Not just being excluded, not just being silenced, but being stripped of dignity, of the right to sit at a table I had once built with my own hands. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the shadows creeping across the garage walls. Something inside me had changed. The pain was still there, raw and sharp, but it was joined now by something else, resolve. I could not let them define me. I could not let their rejection be the final chapter of my life. But in that moment, in that night of exile, I was broken, truly broken. And yet, sometimes, it is in the breaking that a man finds the strength to rise again. When a man is broken, truly broken, he has two choices. He can lie in the dust and let the world bury him, or he can rise, piece by piece, and reclaim what was taken. That night in the garage, I thought I had lost everything. But what I didn't know was that life still held one final card for me, one that would change everything. The morning after my humiliation, I woke stiff and cold, my body aching from the hard stool I had slept on. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, a thought flickered in my mind, something I hadn't considered in years. The house, the very house they treated as their own, the house they whispered about inheriting when I was gone. They didn't know the truth. You see, when Margaret and I bought this place decades ago, we made a decision. She was wiser with money than I ever was, always thinking 3 steps ahead. She said, Elaine, life is unpredictable. People are unpredictable. We need to protect what we've built. So, on her insistence, we had the deed written solely in my name. At the time, it felt unnecessary. These were our children. We trusted them completely. But Margaret, God bless her, had a way of seeing storms on the horizon long before they broke. Lying there in the garage, I realized that while they treated me as if I were powerless, I held in my hands the very roof over their heads. The house was mine, not theirs. And what's more, Margaret and I had set up a will years ago, one they knew nothing about. I could still hear Daniel's words echoing from that phone call. Once Dad's gone, the house will be ours. Oh, how wrong he was. In that will, Margaret and I had made a decision born out of both love and caution. We agreed that the house, along with our savings, would not automatically go to Emma and Daniel. Instead, It would pass to whoever showed genuine care for me in my later years. At the time, we thought it a safeguard, a way to encourage kindness. We never imagined it would be put to the test so brutally. For weeks, I kept this knowledge to myself, carrying it like a secret flame in my chest. Outwardly, I endured their coldness, the whispered comments, the isolation, the meals in the garage. But inside, I no longer felt powerless. Every insult, every slight, every sign that they were waiting for my death. It only confirmed what Margaret and I had feared long ago, and it only strengthened my resolve to honor her foresight. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. The roof had sprung a leak, and Daniel was furious, stomping through the house, cursing about repair costs. He shouted, "This is why we need this place to ourselves. Once Dad's gone, we'll finally fix everything without worrying about him draining us." I stood in the doorway, watching him rant, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel broken. I felt something close to calm. "Daniel," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "this house isn't yours. It never has been. And when I'm gone, it won't be you who decides its future." He froze, his face twisting with confusion. "What are you talking about?" I continued, meeting his eyes. "Your mother and I made sure of it. The deed is in my name alone, and the will. Let's just say it doesn't reward those who wait for a man's death." The color drained from his face. For once, the arrogance slipped, replaced by shock. Emma, who had been listening from the hallway, gasped audibly. "You're lying," Daniel spat. "You wouldn't do that." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Deep down, he knew I wasn't lying. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply turned and walked back toward the garage, leaving them to stew in their panic. For the first time in years, the power was mine. From that day on, their behavior shifted, not out of love, but out of fear. Suddenly, they were softer in their words, more attentive in their actions. Meals appeared on time. Warmer smiles were forced, and invitations to join the table were extended again. But it was too late. I had seen their true faces, and no amount of pretense could erase the scars they had carved into my heart. And here is the justice of it all. I had already rewritten the will months earlier. After Margaret's passing, I left the house and our savings not to Emma or Daniel, but to someone they had never expected, the neighbor's daughter, Lucy. Lucy, who often came by with groceries when she noticed I hadn't been out. Lucy, who sat with me on the porch to hear my stories when no one else cared to listen. Lucy, who showed me kindness without ever asking for anything in return. She wasn't family by blood, but she was family in heart. Margaret would have approved. The day will come, sooner or later, when I take my final breath. When that happens, Emma and Daniel will learn the truth. They will stand in this house they thought was theirs, waiting for papers that will never bear their names. And then, they will finally understand that while they waited for my death, I was planning my justice. I am still here, still alive, still the master of my own story. And when it ends, it will end on my terms, not theirs. When you reach my age, you stop caring so much about the noise of the world. You've seen too much, lost too much, given too much to be distracted by the petty chatter of people who never walked in your shoes. What you do care about is dignity, peace, and the memory you leave behind when your chair sits empty and your voice falls silent. For a long time, I thought my memory would be stained by sorrow, that my children, Emma and Daniel, would carry my story forward as one of weakness, an old man who outlived his usefulness. They stripped me of respect, of love, and nearly of hope. But here's the truth I want anyone listening to hear. No one can take your dignity unless you hand it to them, and I refuse to hand mine away. I gave my children everything I had, my strength, my years, my sacrifices, and they answered with impatience, rejection, and whispers in the dark. That betrayal will never vanish, will always ache like an old wound, but I will not let it define the last chapter of my life. Because I learned something in all this. Blood is not the only bond that matters. Family is not always written in surnames or recorded in documents. Family is kindness. Family is loyalty. Family is whoever stays when the world walks away. I found that in Margaret until her last breath. I found that in Lucy, the neighbor's daughter, who treated me as though I mattered when my own blood did not. I even found it in strangers, the grocer, who always asked about my health, the postman who lingered for a chat because he knew I was lonely. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. To anyone listening who has ever felt unwanted, let me tell you this: you are not measured by the way others treat you. Their cruelty is a reflection of their emptiness, not your worth. I thought I was invisible, but I was wrong. I mattered, if not to my children, then to those who chose to see me. And as for justice, well, I do not seek revenge. I seek balance. The will I leave behind will not be fueled by anger, but by truth. Emma and Daniel will one day stand in this house and realize it was never theirs. They will learn that love cannot be bought with bloodlines, that inheritance is not a birthright but a reward for compassion. Perhaps that lesson will sting. Perhaps it will break them, but maybe, just maybe, it will teach them to treat others differently in the years ahead. When my story is told, I don't want to be remembered as the man who was exiled to a garage, who ate his meals in silence, who waited for death while his children counted the days. I want to be remembered as the man who endured, who rose from humiliation, who found strength in his breaking point. The man who proved that dignity can survive even the coldest rejection. I want people to remember the laughter of my youth, the work of my hands, the love I poured into my wife and children. I want them to remember that I gave everything, and though I received little in return, I still refused to let bitterness rule my heart. If you are young and listening, learn this now. Cherish those who stood by you when you had nothing. One day, when age steals your strength, you will see clearly who your true family is. Choose wisely whom you give your time, your trust, your inheritance. If you are old and listening, know this: you are not a burden. You are a library of wisdom, a vessel of history, a soul with worth. Even if the world tries to push you aside, hold your head high. Your existence matters more than the impatient sighs of those who cannot see your value. And to my children, if you ever hear these words after I am gone, let me say this: I loved you with every breath I had. That love never faded, even when you hurt me. But love does not blind me anymore. You waited for my death, but I lived long enough to see your true hearts. And in the end, I chose peace. Not with you, but beyond you. They waited for my death, but I am still here. I lived long enough to reclaim my dignity, to choose my own ending, to remind the world that a father's worth is not erased by age or cruelty. And when I finally close my eyes, it will not be in despair. It will be with the quiet pride of knowing I endured, I rose again, and I left behind a story worth remembering. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is simply surviving long enough to tell your